Hello, it's Randi Rhodes. Here's a clip from our show, and go to randyrhodes.com for the whole thing and a podcast. Buy a stinking podcast.
Mary had a little man.
The fault. We believe that all men are created equal.
To the magnificent mosaic that is America.
From radio beacon to radio beacon. I have a dream today. Change has come to America.
Believe me.
Knock, knock. Who's there?
It's a figment of your imagination.
Randi Rhodes Show.
Turn up your mind.
The Presidential Committee's report estimated in 1988 that the mob took in $30 billion a year in tax-free money. The report says the 5 families in New York jack up the prices on construction by 20%. At the center of this, Sammy Gravano, who ran construction and concrete for the Gambino crime family.
I literally marvel at the sight of Manhattan when I see it because I controlled it. I literally controlled Manhattan. When I see it at night, those lights and everything about it, I think of Donald Trump and Tishman and everybody else who couldn't build a building if I didn't want to build it.
Oh, my God.
That got me off. Plus, I made a lot of money with it.
Oh, my God. Sammy the Bull Gravano, of all the people that he could mention as he looks out at the skyline of Manhattan, says, if I didn't want a building built, it didn't get built. And, I even told that to Donald Trump and all the other Tishmans, everybody. So I told you we were going to talk, and we are going to talk right now, to Craig Unger, who is an American journalist. He's a writer. He's a graduate of Harvard. And he wrote another book that I read called House of Bush, House of Sod. And now he's got a new book called House of Trump, House of Putin. And this book sort of connects the dots it does connect the dots in a very meaningful way. He writes, I love Vanity Fair. I love everything about Vanity Fair. And he's been a writer for Vanity Fair. He writes for the New Yorker, Esquire magazine, all these other. And this book is one of the best connections between all the different pieces of the Trump family puzzle. And so we welcome him to our show now. Hi, how are you, Craig? Thank you for taking time today.
Thanks for having me.
Sure thing. So I introduced you with a clip of Sammy the Bull Gravano from 1997 because it just ties into everything that we know. I mean, I'm a New Yorker, so everything that I know about Donald Trump and his Italian mafia ties. But your book takes him from the Italian mafia, moves him into the Russian mafia. So I just thought maybe we could start with, when did he decide construction was too crazy and that it was much easier to be mobbed up with the Russians?
Well, he lost a fortune when he expanded into Atlantic City, and he way overexpanded. One of his casinos cost more than $1 billion. And when he came out of that mess, he faced 6 bankruptcies and $4 billion in debt. And he could not possibly continue in the way he had been because he couldn't get a bank loan from anyone. You can't do real estate development without massive, massive loans. And the Russian Mafia came to his rescue. They bailed him out, and basically they own him.
So it started when he went bankrupt in Atlantic City, and he...
You know what? Let me go back even further, because it goes back to 1984.
Yeah.
And he had been with, he had been close, as you said, to the Italian mafia, and they started partnering with the Russians. At the time, Trump's first lawyer was Roy Cohn, who was sort of the dark, satanic prince of the McCarthy era, and he was... Roy Cohn represented 2 of the 5 families of the Italian mafia. And those families began partnering with the Russians in the late 70s and early 80s. And they were making so much money that in 1984, a guy named David Bogadin, who was a Russian mobster, partnering with the Italians, but he went into Trump Tower, which had just been built. It was sort of the crown jewel of the Trump empire and where Trump still has his home even today. And Bogadin put down $6 million. That's the equivalent of about $15 million today. He bought 5 condos, and that, as far as I can tell, was the first episode of money laundering by the Russian mafia using Trump properties.
Right. And this guy seems to be the opening of the floodgates. This guy seems to be working for the Russian mob back in Russia because he's a nobody, right? He's a nothing.
Yeah, but things accelerated enormously after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Right.
And suddenly there were vast amounts of flight capital. Since Putin has been elected, there's been over $1 trillion in flight capital. That's money that's ostensibly from dubious origins, and it needs to be laundered. And if you want to launder that much money, $1 trillion, the only way to do it efficiently is real estate, because you can buy condos left and right. Their value, who knows whether a condo's worth $3 million or $5 million. It's what anyone will pay. And once it's gone into a shell company and can be sold, when you cash out, the money has been laundered. And that's what's been going on with Trump for quite some time. And that's why the Russian mafia sort of owns it.
Right. And what people don't get, I don't think, is that, everybody thinks about their real estate transaction and how they sat at a closing table and they had to show all this ID and they had to sign 1 million documents and all this. I don't think what people get is that you can buy apartments, you can buy real estate anonymously. You don't have to live in it. You don't have to be there for the you could just buy millions of dollars of apartments. You can sell them to other people and keep doing it. So, like, let's say you bought a $5 million apartment, then you sold it to another guy, and then that guy sold it, and then that guy sold it, and then that guy sold it. You've now laundered $20 million.
Right, you could flip it back and forth once you bought it already.
Right.
So there's no telling. So I think of saying he laundered over $1 billion is a very conservative estimate.
Yeah.
It's also, there's one other really important thing I want to make clear about the Russian mafia. And most Americans, when we think of the mafia, we think of the Godfather and John Gotti and Sammy the Bull Gravano. But the Russian mafia is quite different. And it is a state actor. We often say now that Russia is a mafia state, and that's not just a metaphor. At the top of the mafia really is Vladimir Putin. So when you look at the big Russian mobsters, the ones who deal with extortion or black marketeering or human trafficking, ultimately they're allowed to go ahead with all their businesses so long as it serves Putin's goals. So there's a direct line between the Russian mafia and Russian intelligence. And I interviewed a former head of counterintelligence for the KGB, General Oleg Kalugin, and I asked him about it, and he told me, look, the mafia is just part of the KGB. Any information they have, any actions they take, goes directly to the top, to Putin.
So here's my question, okay? If Putin will only allow oligarchs to do things that are in Putin's interest, tell me why he's allowing all of this capital to fly out of Russia and land in Donald Trump's buildings or other people's buildings. You know, we had that other guy who was involved in the Prevezon case, right? Lev Lviv or something who owned a whole...
Lev, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So and he was the person who his properties were taken and frozen by the government during the Prevezon case, which is Natalia Veselnitskaya's case. She was on the side of Prevezon, obviously. Preet Bharara was on the side of the United States arguing in court, and then of course Trump fires him, and so they settle the case. $230 million case gets settled for $6 million. She's here to do the settlement. She goes to Trump Tower and meets with Junior. I mean, that's the scenario. But the question is, if Putin only allows oligarchs to pay him vig, obviously 50% of everything they make has to go to him. In order for them to be oligarchs. Otherwise, you end up like Khodorkovsky. You end up in a cage on television, and he shows a picture and says, hey, oligarchs, this could be you. Pay me, or you end up in a cage, right? That's how he got everybody to pay him. But
right.
Why is he pro letting all this Russia money out of the country? What is he getting in exchange?
Well, according to Bill Browder, who did a lot of business in Russia and was forced out as part of the Magnitsky case, that Putin is worth $200 billion.
Right.
So that gives you an indication of what his share of the VIG is. And I think, I was talking to a former federal prosecutor about this, and he said that, when Trump looks at Putin, he sees a guy who's essentially president for life and has $200 billion, and effectively he says, hey, why not here?
Oh, you think you think that with Putin's help, Trump could be president for life, or at least this is what Trump thinks?
I think there are a lot of extra constitutional things, and Trump is lowering the bar day after day and violating constitutional norms and so forth. And I think at the end of this, we are on a collision course, and Trump will either be forced out of office or he'll do something pretty heinous in terms of taking extra constitutional measures.
Well, it is interesting because Roger Stone is saying today that Trump Jr. is next in the barrel. He says he has excellent sources, and so I'm guessing Roger Stone is flipped. I mean, because how would he know, who's next on the list? But here's why I asked you the question about what is Putin getting, because in the Steele dossier, okay, Christopher Steele writes this. He says an intelligence exchange had been running between Trump's team and the Kremlin with the direct knowledge of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Within this context, Putin's priority requirement had been for intelligence on the activities, business and otherwise, in the U.S. of leading Russian oligarchs and their families. Trump and his associates duly had obtained and supplied the Kremlin with this information. So what Chris Steele is surmising here is that there's been a lot of defecting or coming over here and taking money with you, and Putin wanted information on those people. And so he had entered into an agreement with Donald Trump that Donald Trump would provide him with information about the people whose capital was flying out of Russia and landing in his apartments, and that intelligence exchange has never been fully explained.
Right. When I first read that in the Steele dossier, I thought that was the most outlandish allegation of all, much more so than the sexual allegation. And I thought it that way because being a spy requires a lot of discipline, and Donald Trump, whatever he is, he has no discipline whatsoever. So I thought it was ridiculous. But the more research I did, I kept going back to this firm called Bayrock, a real estate development company. And it opened in Trump Tower around 2002. And they went to Donald Trump and they came up with a new model for him to do business because he had been $4 billion in debt after Atlantic City. There was no way any Western bank would loan him a dime. And they basically helped him come up with a new model in which he licensed his name, he franchised it, just as McDonald's franchises fast food outlets. Donald Trump began franchising luxury condos. So Bayrock would raise the money. There were other partners as well. But in the case of the Trump Soho, which is just a mile or so from where I live here in New York.
Oh, is that where you are? I know where you are.
Yes.
Great pizza place on Spring Street right there. Best Sicilian ever, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so they would raise a few $100 million, and you could see where it came from. Some of it came, for example, through a group called the FL Group, which was an Icelandic company that the Russian Mafia used to funnel money through. And it went on and helped develop some of Trump's properties. So all of that money, the hundreds of millions of dollars required to develop any single Trump tower, a lot of that money was actually being laundered. Plus, they were selling the condos. Each condo costs, I think, a minimum of $1 million. It's sort of a low ball for a Trump condo. And they sold Trump, over 1,300 condos were sold through using criteria that set off alarm bells with anti-money laundering people. That is, these were all cash purchases, and they were done through anonymous shell companies. So there's a vast amount of money there being laundered for and by oligarchs and Russian mobsters, and Bayrock would have had all those records and could easily funnel them to the Kremlin.
So what do you think Felix Sater? Felix Sater obviously has a very interesting past, and for much of the last year and a half, I didn't know if Felix Sater was a good guy, if Felix Sater was a bad guy. It's just not clear. But Felix Sater obviously comes from Russia. I think his father was a Russian mob guy. He's best friends with Michael Cohen. They've been friends since they're teenagers in Brighton Beach. You know, I grew up in Brooklyn, so I know the area really well, and I'm Ukrainian too, so I get what, that it's little Odessa. But Felix Sater seems to have been part of a pump and dump stock scheme and got into a bad fight in a bar. You know, we know the story where he stabbed a guy with the back of a margarita glass, and then suddenly he starts cooperating with the FBI. Felix Sater is part of Bayrock with a couple other Russian guys. Is he a good guy in this or a bad guy in this from what you know? Because he's over at Bayrock raising all this, Russian flight capital for the building of Trump Soho, which eventually goes bankrupt because A, it's not in Soho, and B, it was fake money. It was just, funny money. But what do you make of Felix Sater? Because Trump had testified in some other case that if Felix Sater walked into a room, he wouldn't know him. He obviously perjured himself. Because Felix Sater was a senior advisor to the Trump organization and was part of this Bayrock group. Now, it seems to me that Felix Sater, I don't know. I can't figure this one out for real. But
Well, you're not the only one who can't figure it out. I call my first chapter on him the International Man of Mystery. And I think the central question is, we know he has at least a double life in the sense that he's a twice convicted felon. And he was secretly working for the FBI and CIA.
Right.
My question is he actually have a triple life? And what has he really been working for the Russian Mafia the whole time? So there are a lot of trips he made. As you said, he initially said, he barely knew Michael Cohen. Well, in fact, they've known each other for more than 30 years.
Yeah.
They have been close friends for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And they all do have at least indirect ties to the Russian mob. And I'm particularly interested in the last few years when Felix was going back and forth to Russia a lot. He did work with some companies that are of considerable interest in Russia, and that appeared to have ties to the most powerful mobster of all. He's sort of the brains behind the Russian Mafia, and he's one of the most powerful of all, who is a man named Simeon Mogilevich.
Right.
And he's an interesting guy who pops up again and again and again in this story.
Well, they say, in your book, you call him the boss of bosses. Actually, the FBI calls him the boss of bosses, and he apparently masterminded how to launder money. That's like his expertise, and that he directed the expansion of the Russian mob here into the United States in the early 90s when the Soviet Union was falling apart and flight capital, people wanted to, take their fortunes and get it out of Russia because they didn't know what was coming. And now they're apparently doing it for one of two reasons. They're either doing it because Donald Trump is giving Putin something for his money, or because they're trying to get away from Putin's VIG. And again, that's a question I can't answer. I don't know which it is.
Right. Well, there are a lot of complicated internal politics among the mobsters and all of that. But I keep going back to Trump. And it seems to me that, last week, it seems so long ago when he took away John Brennan's security clearance. And the irony was that if there's one person in the United States who would never qualify for security clearance, it's Donald Trump.
I heard you say that. I heard you say that. I was like, you know what? That's the best thing I've ever heard. You're right. He could not get. And in fact, Jared Kushner couldn't. Do you know? It's so interesting that they really can't get these security clearances.
Right.
It's just so.
It should mean he's not qualified to be president. That's pure and simple.
I don't understand, why it doesn't fall under the 25th Amendment. He isn't able to get briefings. Harry Reid, before he left, said give him fake briefings. Just tell him stuff. He won't know what it is, and he won't know the difference. And that was probably the best advice anybody ever gave with regard to this man.
Yes, I mean it's just obscene when you go into this. I started off early on in this, and I heard about these ties to the Russian Mafia, and the first thing I did as a reporter is there are wonderful databases online where you can see the purchase and sale history of every home in Manhattan, and I went right to Trump Tower and all the Trump properties. I saw all the Russian names, and I just started Googling, and it was like if you filter the general population by do they live in Trump properties and have Russian names, the crime rate is very, very high.
That's so funny. I know people just don't understand what it takes to sit down and research, but it's really, God bless the internet in some weird way. It's good and it's bad, but it does make, finding things about this man, very attainable, and you got to sit there and say, well, I know you're a brilliant guy, Craig. I mean, I'm not trying to take this away from you. You are a Harvard guy, and Vanity Fair is like my Bible. But honestly, you got to say, if you know it, Mueller's got to know it.
Absolutely. A lot of what I had came from FBI documents, and you can see the threat of the Russian Mafia growing. But then, of course, 9/11 came along, and the FBI completely switched its priorities to terrorism.
It's so interesting because Steve Bannon, who's very, very close to Donald Trump, because he's racist enough for Steve, actually said that Russian money laundering was going to be a problem for Donald Trump. You remember that?
I do not. When did he say that?
He said that right after he left. He said a couple of really nasty things about Donald Trump. And he said, one of the things that he said was that Russian money laundering was going to be a big problem for Donald Trump.
Yeah, well, it is. And we'll see how far this goes. But, I had, obviously, I wanted to get the book out before the midterms. And I did not run out of material. I got to tell you that there is a lot more out there.
Well,
and
I know you
participated.
I know you participated in this this new movie that's coming out. Tell me about that. This is Jack Bryan is the director of this movie, but this movie is called Active Measures.
Active Measures, yes, and the premiere will be this Friday in New York, or Saturday rather. And Jack started working on it. I had just finished an article which led to my book about Trump and money laundering that appeared in the New Republic. And he's interviewed dozens and dozens of key people and put it together. I have not seen the final cut, but I think it's going to be the first cinematic, sort of full-length explanation of this. A lot of I think everyone is being bombarded with bits and pieces of the puzzle,
yes.
one by one.
Yes.
And it's very hard to have a long overview, and I tried to do that in my book, and I think Jack has done the same with Active Measures.
Yeah, and that's why I really gravitated to your book, because it does do that. It helps you walk through. It's it seems like such a complicated story because the money is so big and there's so many Russian names and it's very hard to pronounce them and all these things, run counter to a smooth read. But your book is great for that, and the idea that it's not that complicated is really important. What basically the synopsis of your book, as I read it, was that this started a long time ago. This started in the 80s when the Soviet Union was in trouble and people wanted their money to come out of the Soviet Union before it fell during the fall. And then even more so once, the oligarchs took over under, the crazy dancing one. And then, of course, finally with Putin. And Trump was positioned in such a desperate position. He was in dire straits. He had gone belly up. This was going to be the biggest bankruptcy. He had hosted the Russian mob at his casinos. He knew them. And they started buying his apartments blindly, anonymously. Nobody had to know, all this. And he just got used to the money. He just got used to it. And there's no way that he could not know who he was selling to. He might maintain that he did not know, but there is no way he did not know, especially with the Palm Beach mansion, which there was no pretense about that. This guy that bought it didn't even pretend to live in it, right? And he paid twice what it was worth on the market. So, I mean, it's really a very basic story of a guy who needed money and was willing to do anything to get it.
Right. And I mean, what it comes down to, and it took me a while to say words like this, but what it ends up is you have a Russian asset in the White House. That this is a man who is working for Russian intelligence, Donald Trump, the President of the United States. And you can see it in the policies he's taking that essentially are giving Putin everything he wants and not fighting back.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first clue was when they changed the platform at the convention. That was Paul Manafort. You see, this is another reason why John McCain and Donald Trump, were mortal enemies. Remember that John McCain went to Ukraine when the Orange Revolution was going on, and Yanukovych was still there. And McCain went there and stood with the protesters. This is another reason why Donald Trump can't say a nice word about John McCain and why John McCain doesn't want Donald Trump at his funeral. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
And at the same time, McCain's advisors included Rick Davis, who was working with Manafort and taking money from Deripaska. And they actually had a meeting between McCain and Deripaska. So the Russians were trying to rope in McCain, and he would not have anything to do with it.
Right, and Deripaska actually, I believe, is the guy. See, I think what Manafort actually did, and, this might come out, it might not. I mean, again, we're left to guess. But I think what Manafort actually did was give a media plan, that the media plan that he used for at the behest of Yanukovych to, put Timoshenko in prison and the whole 9 yards, that he gave Deripaska, for the low bargain basement price of $10 million, the keys to our kingdom, a media plan using Breitbart and the Mercers and Cambridge Analytica, the whole thing. I think he sold that. And Deripaska didn't see anything being done with it. And so that's why he started suing Paul Manafort for his money back. And Manafort's sending emails and saying, well, don't you see what's going on in the media? Can't we use this to make me whole? And he's trying to tell Oleg, I'm doing it. And you're right. Oleg Deripaska was going to rat them all out and tell McCain, and McCain didn't want to partner with them. And so there's, but it's interesting that in this movie, in this Active Measures, which obviously I haven't seen, Hillary Clinton is in it, John McCain is in it, you're in it, Michael Isikoff is in it, Michael McFaul, the former ambassador to Russia, John Podesta is in it, General Shalikashvili is in it, James Woolsey, who was like practically, CIA director under Trump, he's in it. I just can't wait to see it. Yeah.
It's a fascinating time in history. And I think going back through all this stuff, I realized that the entire post-Cold War period is very, very different than I think most Americans see it. And then Russia, we are in, I call the first chapter a virtual World War III, and that this is a new kind of global conflict. And it's one without bullets, bombs, or boots in the air, or boots on the ground, rather, excuse me. And instead, it's using cyber warfare, it's using hacking, and it's using the Russian Mafia, which is one weapon in Putin's arsenal. And it's a very, very powerful one.
Yeah, and this use of social media and picking hot-button issues and being on both sides of it to get people to yell at each other here in the United States because a house divided cannot stand. That's as old as this country. So, he's very good at the information warfare, this Putin guy is. And people don't, some people get it, but 30% of this country just won't look at it. They just won't see it. And they don't understand that everything from vaccinations to Black Lives Matter has been used to pit American against American. And it's all so that, our little experiment will fail because a house divided this way so virulently doesn't trust each other. And, it's like I said, it's sad that McCain died in the middle of this. It really is, because this was like his thing, was trying to reach across the aisle, trying to get people to compromise. It's just so sad. And that President Trump is not invited is, a very, very strong last word, Yeah,
there was a fascinating photo this morning from Washington of all the flags at half-mast for John McCain, but not at the White House.
They just did it. They just, at 4 o'clock this afternoon, he put out some sort of a decent statement and lowered it to half-staff.
Okay.
It's sad. Anyway, I love
yeah.
your book. Thank you so much for joining us, Craig Unger. The book is called House of Trump, House of Putin. It's on sale. Get it at Amazon, everybody, and read it. It's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy.
Anytime. All right. Told you. And you know what? We made it through an interview, and the only breaking news was Trump is at half staff. Go to RandiRhodes.com for the whole thing and a podcast. Buy a stinking podcast.